Hey there, I hope you're having a beautiful day. Welcome back to the Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Show, where we talk about all things intergenerational trauma. So today we are going to get digging deep into the roots of intergenerational resilience because we're talking about autonomic regulation, and that's really the root of building that intergenerational resilience. So if autonomic regulation is really the foundation of intergenerational trauma therapy, but why is it so hard to implement and use with complex or complicated families? That's what we're going to find out today. We're going to talk about 7 pitfalls that therapists can find themselves in when they're trying to use autonomic regulation in the context of intergenerational trauma. So autonomic regulation really is the cornerstone of transforming intergenerational pain into resilience, but it's so hard to support these families to develop that regulation. So that's why we're going to go over these 7 pitfalls. First is difficulties in identifying intergenerational trauma, not knowing what parts you're seeing is actually intergenerational trauma and maybe have much deeper roots and need more intervention in a specialized way, and a lack of specialized training. Challenges in improving autonomic regulation. So the difficulties that you'll run into incorporating polyvagal interventions into your therapy, recognizing and addressing autonomic dysregulation, not just in one person, but in the whole family system, and looking at empowering clients in their healing journey and integrating regulation techniques with other interventions. So the difficulty in identifying intergenerational trauma is those complex patterns and how it manifests in a family. It makes it challenging to address the root causes efficiently and effectively. So sometimes we feel like we're chasing our tails and we're not making any progress, and there's always a crisis here and a crisis there that we can never really kind of get down to the root of things. And it's really easy to get distracted by that complex nature and not recognize it may be the autonomic dysregulation within the family that's causing some of these difficulties, and that autonomic dysregulation is the root. So, it really is, when you're dealing with intergenerational trauma, autonomic regulation and polyvagal interventions are really the most important intervention because it's the foundation and it's of therapy, but it's also related to the long-standing impacts of intergenerational trauma. So when you see intergenerational trauma, you may be working with parents who have never experienced co-regulation. They have experienced co-dysregulation, but they've never had anybody that can kind of anchor in their window of tolerance or their social engagement system and really be present and help them feel present, calm, regulated. So the interactions with the therapist may be very different for them. And this can also be very triggering because it can feel threatening to them because they may have never felt it before. And then the therapist may look at that and interpret kind of several repeated experiences of that in therapy as kind of resistance, not wanting, like not participating in therapy or putting up barriers, which I personally do not like that word. I look at resistance as resilience that's no longer useful. So that resistance in a relationship at one point probably kept the person safe. It's just no longer necessary. The other way that therapists can interpret this autonomic dysregulation is that it's part of their personality, or these are personality factors that probably aren't going to change. So those are 2 kind of landmines in intergenerational trauma therapy that we have to be really careful of. In intergenerational trauma, when you see this in your office, you will know that both parents and children are easily dysregulated. They have very faulty neuroception, they're highly reactive, and they co-dysregulate each other very quickly. And this is because they have a lack of autonomic resilience. So autonomic resilience is having accurate neuroception. So they accurately perceive threat. They're not perceiving threat everywhere when it possibly isn't there. So their neuroception is accurate. They can return to regulation following an experience or a period of dysregulation. So they can get back into that window of tolerance or social engagement system. And they have a wide window of tolerance. So they can tolerate a fairly good amount of stress, which causes them to have that autonomic resilience. Where people who have been impacted by intergenerational trauma typically do not have a lot of autonomic resilience. And that's one of the main things that we need to help them with, is to develop accurate neuroception, have a wide window of tolerance, and have it be easy to get back into a state of regulation after a period of dysregulation. So that is that pitfall. So now we're going to talk about a lack of specialized training. So intergenerational trauma therapy by nature is very complex, and attempting to improve autonomic regulation can really feel daunting. It's a huge task because you probably have at least one parent, possibly two, and then all the kids that you have to somehow get the regulation to the whole family and in the family system. So if you don't have a specific structure to follow, it's going to be very overwhelming. And you'll probably ask yourself, well, where do you start? Do you start with the children, the parents? Do you do both of them at the same time? So it can be fairly complex. And there's different case scenarios when you would want to start with the child and help the parent, but really work on the child's dysregulation. Or there might be times where you really want to work on the parent's dysregulation instead. And then the next question you'll ask yourself is, how do you stop this huge cycle of dysregulation? Like, how do you get that to stop? And that can be really challenging. So that's where specialized training has to have an efficient and effective framework to calm that family nervous system and be as efficient as possible, so that it gives all the family members hope that there are different experiences that are healthy and that are good for them, and that they're able to access those. So the dysregulation in the family is actually a self-supporting system. It perpetuates itself. So one person, a parent, will get dysregulated, the child will get dysregulated, the parent will get more dysregulated, the child will get more dysregulated. So it self-supports its system, and it almost becomes like a closed system where it's hard to shift that to get some change in there. And this co-dysregulation at the very root is what causes the transmission of intergenerational trauma. So this is where that parent-child relationship and the attachment is impacted because of this dysregulation and the impacts on relationships. So again, if autonomic regulation takes a long time for them to learn and to be able to self-regulate through our co-regulation with them, the family may lose hope, and that cycle just continues to perpetuate itself. So autonomic regulation is the quickest way to support the family, to provide them hope, and to see that therapy can work. So this is why it's not only important because it is the root of the transmission and the intergenerational trauma, it is also the key to getting out of it. I'm going to take a quick drink of water. So in a family, and in a complex family impacted by intergenerational trauma, there can be huge challenges in improving autonomic resilience and regulation. So if the therapist has a limited understanding of autonomic regulation and co-regulation in complex families, they'll have limited outcomes and interventions that they can use. Some families have significantly more impacts of intergenerational trauma and may have huge difficulties with autonomic regulation. They may have limited experience with co regulation and may be reactive to that. So, in sessions with the therapist, they may feel very uncomfortable when we are not kind of getting dysregulated along with them, and it's not following their typical pattern, because that's a very different experience for them. So, co regulation for some clients may feel very threatening or unsafe. So, we have to really watch for that and help them feel safety in the midst of that co regulation. Children may also feel very threatened by co regulation, especially when there's attachment disruptions, because those attachment disruptions and strategies that they use are what keeps them safe in relationships where attachment has negative impacts. So children may even feel really uncomfortable with co-regulation. So, in order to ensure progress, we have to be aware of the safety and ensuring that there's safety. And also, we need to be very focused and streamlined about it. So, it's difficult to achieve without a specific framework. With less complicated families or with an individual therapy, you can do this kind of as needed, or you can go really into it with some of Deb Dana's work. But it's a lot more flexible. When you're working with a family system, you need to be much more structured and have a specific framework to address the dysregulation at all levels within the family. So, what are the pitfalls with incorporating polyvagal intervention? So, most people I know, most therapists are working with polyvagal interventions to a degree. Um, but when you're working with the whole family system, where the heck do you start? So, there's so many targets for intervention. How do you pick the best spot to start? So, one thing that we need to do is we need to make the way that we introduce autonomic regulation and use polyvagal interventions, it should be consistent across generations. So, you're going to want what the parent has learned to be similar enough to the child so that they can say, oh, that was the tiger coming out, instead of them just trying to get on my nerves. So they'll start to kind of pick out, they'll be able to see through their learning what's happening in their child. It just needs to be parallel enough that they can make those connections. So when parents have greater awareness of their own autonomic state, they understand it, they can have much more understanding and compassion for the child's behavior, because they understand it, that those fight reactions aren't just trying to get on your nerves or aren't being a bad kid. They're just an autonomic reaction that the nervous system thinks there's danger. So that's where it becomes really important for parents to understand that in their children. And it also improves the parent skills at co-regulation. And then when there's better co-regulation, there's better attachment. So that's the kind of the foundation is the safety and the co-regulation. And then that helps with improving attachment over time. So although polyvagal theory is very well known, some therapists may not be trained, and it's sometimes not applied to a whole family system, which is quite complex. Just like the family system, the family's complex. The interventions and the use of the polyvagal interventions is going to be complex as well. It'll be hard to learn polyvagal theory and apply it directly to a family without some specialized training, because of how complex it is and because of the impacts of intergenerational trauma, that you really have to know that. So the best way to learn that is to incorporate those interventions with families and to get specific or specialized training. So the next pitfall is recognizing and addressing autonomic dysregulation. So this can be a daunting task for therapists to identify the signs of autonomic dysregulation in clients, especially within the context of intergenerational trauma. And knowing how to address these symptoms effectively can be very, very challenging for therapists. So this is why assessment is so important, and knowing the impacts of intergenerational trauma, so that you can tie those back to autonomic states and difficulties with co-regulation. So it's important, the assessment is important for both treatment planning and identifying the best route to intervention. So in some cases, you want to start with just the parent. You might want to start with parent coaching to teach them how to kind of calm that family nervous system, or you might want to address their complex trauma right away. You might want to start with the child first. You might want to start with the child and the parent kind of in a parallel. So each case has a different way of how you intervene for them. So if you're not specifically trained regarding the impacts of intergenerational trauma, there may also be difficulties in case formulation or how you see the cases that you're working with. So what may happen is some of the impacts of intergenerational trauma look like personality. So it might look like kind of stormy interpersonal relationships or all or nothing thinking, kind of self-focus, those kind of things, which if we interpret those as personality, it's going to be different interventions that may not help the family system as well. And we might get stuck that this isn't changeable. But when we look at these as the impacts of intergenerational trauma and we address those impacts and we build that autonomic resilience, then it looks totally different. And there's a lot of change that can happen within the family system. So the complexity of intergenerational trauma causes huge complications in recognizing and addressing the autonomic dysregulation. It can be extreme in some families and very intense. Some families, it can get very dangerous when there's a high level of dysregulation. So we have to be really careful. And this can make it even more daunting for a therapist to try to step into helping them regulate, but they're a very volatile family that has there's people with histories of violence in the family. So we've got to really have this mapped out very, very well. The next pitfall is, how do we empower clients in their own healing regarding autonomic regulation and helping them understand this? So autonomic dysregulation, when it becomes stuck, so this isn't just a fight or flight response in a grocery store that calms after you're out of the event or after you realize there isn't any true danger and you can kind of cope through that. That's not stuck. That's an appropriate reaction. It becomes stuck when it happens over and over and that doesn't have the flexibility and the neuroception becomes faulty. So this can cause huge barriers for healing if you're not aware of what to look for. In addition, self-beliefs, how we perceive ourselves, are reinforced by autonomic regulation and that cycle of neuroception. So the autonomic state is the precursor or leads to the story of how we interpret this event that caused that state. So how do we understand the situation, our fight or flight response? How do we understand that in the context? And it usually reinforces self-beliefs. And in families with intergenerational trauma, there's typically a lot of negative self-beliefs due to the impact. So I'm a bad kid, I'm not lovable, the world is a terrible place, it's not safe. So these will get reinforced when they have that cycle of neuroception continues. So another thing is negative self-beliefs can be kind of generated between family members, or they're kind of passed on as well, that you don't trust anybody because the world is a terrible place. We're not going to deal with anybody because everybody's dangerous. Like those self-beliefs, and beliefs about people and the families can be very negative, and they can be passed on between generations. So this is, again, where assessment of those impacts is very, very critical. So when clients are able to gain that autonomic regulation, they have more autonomic resilience, and they learn from polyvagal interventions, they have a new and empowering understanding of their behaviors. So one of the things that is really important is sometimes people in a trauma, they'll freeze. So their dorsal vagal response will just take over, and they'll just freeze. They won't fight back. Somebody will take something from them, or they'll steal, or they won't fight back. And if they understand their nervous system, they can understand that their nervous system did what they thought did what it thought it needed to do to keep the person safe under true life threat. So it's not a weakness that you didn't fight back. Your nervous system said, shut it down, because if you don't, you're probably going to die. So that's having them understand that can help empower them that they can trust their nervous system and they can trust their reactions, but we do need to regulate those. They can also understand that from a more adaptive nature of their behavior and their responses. So if they had a flight response and quickly ran away from something, and everybody's kind of like, what happened? Why are you scared? Or they call them fraidy cat or scaredy cat. They will understand that that was an adaptive response and their nervous system just took over. So it changes that story, and they understand themselves in a different and more resilient way. And that's where we have the development of adversity-based resilience, where people who have been through complex trauma, intergenerational trauma, they're typically very, very strong people, because they haven't basically given up, and they haven't been totally overcome by the trauma. So there is this adversity-based resilience that you only get by fighting a battle. But the problem is when that battle comes close to the end, or when you've been in it for a while, you're exhausted. So this is a concept that I really work with my clients to understand, that it's not that you're weak. It's not that you can't handle things. You're exhausted from fighting, and you have a lot of adversity-based resilience because a lot of people wouldn't have made it through what you've made it through. So it shifts and transforms that whole understanding of the story. And then they can regain their courage, and they have greater strength. They're kind of a witness to their own strength. So it really transforms the meaning of their behavior and their responses, which is really what we want, because of those negative self-beliefs that are one of the impacts of intergenerational trauma. So the last pitfall is, how do we integrate these techniques in with other interventions? Because there's so many interventions for trauma that it really, it can be overwhelming to know which route to go. It's kind of, once you get in one of these trainings, it's a large investment. So how do you pick, and how do you know which one and how to apply them together? So basically, Dr. Porges always talks about how safety is the therapy. And I believe Deb Dana talks about this too, that the main thing we have to do in therapy is to offer a safe space. So that safety is number one, and it's foundational to any of the other interventions. So I usually always start with some type of polyvagal intervention, regardless if we're talking about anxiety, depression, trauma. Safety is the most important foundation, and it's needed to go through any other therapy intervention. So integrating polyvagal interventions can provide the grounding and self-regulation that's necessary to do trauma processing, like brain spotting and EMDR. So this is like that preparation phase of EMDR, where you're really building their ability to self-regulate, because the trauma processing can be very dysregulating at times. So in the intergenerational trauma program, phase 2 is an adult complex trauma intervention, and phase 3 is the trauma intervention for children and teens. And it can be used, those two can be used independently in order to build that resourcing, grounding, and preparation for those trauma processing. So it's a very flexible framework, which is meant to be that way because of the complexity of intergenerational trauma. So those are your 7 pitfalls. Be sure to watch out for them and get those polyvagal interventions and skills. So as you can see, autonomic regulation really is at the root of intergenerational resilience, and it has to be central to any type of intergenerational trauma program. Those are the pitfalls that require some specialized learning. And one of the best places to start if you're working with families, I would say, would be the Intergenerational Trauma Toolkit. It's an intervention that uses polyvagal interventions with families and with attachment, but it's not as robust for the more complex families. So that's a really good kind of taste of it, and it will get you started with some of the foundational skills that you'll need. So if you want to check that out, you can go to intergenerationaltraumatoolkit.com, and I'll post the link around this video for that training. So thank you so much for attending. Next week, we're going to look at the next part of the intergenerational resilience method, which is attachment. So I hope you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next week.